Hello, everyone. A very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar of the Chef Infrastructure Management Best Practices. This is a part of the series of webinars wherein we are talking about some of the best practices that you can implement in your day-to-day workflows to get better and efficient results. Today, specifically, we'll be talking about building immutable infrastructure using policy files. So I see a couple of people still joining in, so let's give them a couple of seconds to settle down. All right. I am hoping everyone is settled down and excited for today's webinar. I am Jonathan Pereira. I am part of the DevRel team here at Chef. And what we do or what our team really focuses on is helping practitioners like you to get the best out of Chef and succeed in your DevOps journey. So this means everything right from getting the right content, which will help you in terms of tutorials, in terms of blog posts, uh, having webinars like this, having live streaming sessions wherein you can come talk to us and learn the best practices and what's latest in Chef, as well as an ever bubbling community which is glowing and growing on Slack. So if at this point you are still unable to hear me or you're facing any technical issues, I would highly recommend restarting your browser or your platform that you're using. But like Riza just mentioned, either ways, you do not have to worry. So even if at any point in time you need to drop off or you need to just end the webinar or something breaks, do not worry. We will be recording this and a copy of this recording will be shared with everyone, whoever has registered. So what are we going to be talking about today? So the entire focus today is going to be on Chef Infra Policyfiles. I will be giving an overview of what exactly Infra Policyfiles are, and more importantly, why you should be considering them, especially in your day-to-day workflows. Also, we'll cover a couple of policy file basics like attributes and examples of when and where you can use them. And then I'll also be demoing how you can use policy files. And finally, we'll end with a question answer round wherein you can bring up all your questions. So use the widget of the Q&A widget down below in your Zoom to push in all your questions and we'll answer each and every one of them. Like I was mentioning in the beginning, this webinar is a part of the series of webinars in the Chef Infra Best Practices quickfire series. And we already had a couple of very interesting webinars, which I highly recommend. If you haven't been a part of, you should definitely watch them on demand. We had the new Chef Infra client release with Cook Style webinar earlier, and we also had a couple of other interesting webinars which showed how you can configure Chef Infra and compliance, how you can, and this one is one of my favorite, how you can test Chef Infra cookbooks with using Docker. Also, how you can use custom resources to build and create your cookbooks. And another very interesting one that just happened a couple of weeks back was how you can automate your deployments using GitHub Actions. And today we are going to be talking about building immutable infrastructure with policy files. And there will be a couple of other similar best practices which we will be highlighting. For example, how you can, the next one I'm assuming is going to be on Chef Workstation, and you should stay tuned for more details. So let's get started with Chef Infra policy files. Let's first look at what exactly are policy files. So I'm sure a lot of you already have this confusion around Bookshelf and how policy files are different. So let me go out and just start with the definition of policy file. So at its core, policy file is just a method to manage your roles, your environments, and all your community cookbook data, all within a single document that would be uploaded to the Chef Infra server. So basically what this means is this provides you a single source of truth wherein you can define which chef cookbooks would run on your system. You can define the run list of all the recipes that will run along with the configuration parameters. The other good thing about policy files and where it really makes a huge difference is it resolves all the dependencies mentioned in your cookbooks. So this kind of saves time, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this later on. But before we even dive deeper into that, let's try to see where exactly policy files really fit into your workflow. So let me let me just picture, or let me just paint a picture of the traditional workflow that we're used to, right? So we have developers writing code, then that usually goes into the QA, which then probably goes into UAT. And then finally, if everything is fine, would probably end up in production. Now, in each of the stages, there would be different roles assigned to different people, different resources, as well as different environments, each specifically created for that particular stage. And I do not even need to get into the details of how big a damage it would be if you happen to, by mistake, use your QA environment in production. That could literally mess up your entire business. And that's not something anyone wants to see. And especially given that at Chef, we have a lot of customers who use our software for managing financial transactions, managing personal data. All of this is very critical, and it was really the need of the hour that we figured out a way to manage all of this, all of these roles and environments in one central place, and which is how policy files came into existence. So we highly recommend policy files to all our customers, as it helps them to handle dependencies as well as change management across all the Chef Infra managed infrastructure. And because the way policy file combines the very best parts of roles, environments, and workshops into a single workflow, we tend to go overboard in suggesting that practitioners adopt and use policy files wherever possible. Now let's talk a little about the features of policy files and how it really kind of outshines, or why you should really be considering it. So right off the bat, it's obvious that if I'm talking about a single source of truth, that single source of truth has to remain immutable. And that's exactly what policy files does. So all the dependencies, or all the criterias, all the requirements that you mentioned within your policy file, be it for the cookbooks, be it for the run list, all of these are then converted into a lock.json file, which is immutable, and it's not going to change irrespective of any other external changes affecting either the cookbooks or the other recipes or any other dependencies which are mentioned within the cookbooks. So also given that you have during the chef client run, all of these dependencies uh, being being pulled right in the beginning, Chef Infra Client doesn't have to recalculate the dependencies at the start of every run, which, along with making it faster and more efficient, it also makes this entire process more robust, and which makes sure that your entire configuration is very safe and you do not have to worry about what or how your system would behave during in production. The second thing that really brings a lot of relief to a lot of practitioners is the safer workflows that policy files promises. With policy files, it's much more easier to publish development versions of cookbooks to the chef server, and all of this without the risk of having to worry about mutating the production versions. So irrespective of any changes that happen in your cookbooks, your production environment or your production server isn't going to really get affected. Now, this one is something that has a direct dollar value. Now, like in the beginning, I mentioned all of the dependencies are prefetched right at the beginning. This means that given that you do not have to fetch your dependencies over and over again every time it's being run, uh, in cases wherein you are using a cloud service provider, for example, you do not have that much compute required, or you do not have that much bandwidth required, which directly means that your business is going to be saving dollars. And all of the cookbook versions and run lists are locked in. So the number of times these changes are even going to happen are very, very few. And finally, the most important one, according to me, managing your roles and environment. With policy files, you can literally manage all your changes right from dev to staging to production, using controlled promotions, similar to like what you would have done in Docker maybe. But what really changes is it gives you that added boost that, given that the entire configuration is robust, you do not have to worry that you would see something completely different in your production versus what you did while you were testing it out. Even if you do not, even if you have forgotten to mention any specific roles or mention the specific environments. And the other part is that you really need to remember is this also means that there are no more pin cookbook versions and environments or roles that cannot be versioned. So let's look at some policy files basics. So the first question that we'll look at is when exactly to use policy files. So obviously, you have definitely come across a situation wherein dependencies of cookbook is a huge pain, and it just gets worse with the number of increasing number of cookbooks that you keep using. So with policy files, this problem is tackled very systematically because, for starters, all of your dependencies are irrelevant for the configuration, except the ones that are specifically mentioned within your policy file, which means irrespective of the changes that happen later on or before, your infrastructure isn't going to get affected in any kind of way. The second, and which happens to be my favorite, is onboarding new users. I'm sure you have had new colleagues joining you in your team, or you just had to give some kind of knowledge transfer within the team, or in situations wherein you are transitioning to a different project, you had to provide the knowledge to the existing or the new owners of the project. And at this time, it becomes really, really messy to walk through everything that's happened in the last months or years. In some cases, that there have been times wherein you just overlook things, and then the new person has to then come searching for you months later to figure out why something is the way it is. But policy files does away with that. So traditionally, you would probably be talking to the new guy about roles, environments, bookshelf, pinning. But with policy files, all you need to do is tell him about data bags and the policy file itself. And he wouldn't have to worry more anymore. Because with policy files, everything is directly mentioned and it's going to execute all by itself. Change management can be really, really difficult, especially in large organizations. And while I definitely get why a lot of higher ups, especially from the management perspective, are very skeptical when it comes to all the changes that we as practitioners suggest. And to a certain extent, they are right, because it does have a direct effect on production, which means it directly affects the customers, and which directly means it affects the business directly. So while it's of obvious reason that they would be skeptical about managing change within the organization, especially with tools like this. Policy files gives you that additional confidence that irrespective of any future changes that happen to your dependencies or anything that you're using, your infrastructure wouldn't really get affected by it. So you still are in complete control of all the changes and all you can control the execution within your organization. And finally, the most important one, uh, this is one of the reasons why policy files makes a huge difference to practitioners, and that's when they're working in air-gapped environments. Now, policy files gives you the option to export. So for example, if you're working on your system, sitting on your desk in your comfy chair, it's simple to test everything and push it into the server and see it working. But when it comes to working with an air-gapped environment, it really changes everything. So here you then need to go and use the export from policy files, and you can still sit in your comfortable chair and be assured that everything is going to be working just the way you tested it on your system, on your desk. So now that we got a brief overview of what policy files are and when to use them, let's see what they really look like and how to actually use them. All right, so for this demo today, I'm going to be making a directory wherein I'm going to create my policy file. And for this webinar, let's just call it InfraWeb. So and let's cd into it. All right. So now there are two ways you can go about creating a policy file. And just let me open this folder for us to see how things turn out. So like I was saying, there are two ways you can go about creating policy files. One is the traditional way wherein you open up a notepad and you start writing all the contents by yourself. But at Chef, we always believe that we need to help practitioners get a boost so that they do not have to feel so worried or scared about writing code themselves, which is why Chef gives you an entire template for your policy files, and you just need to enter the details and everything will be taken care. So to do that, we can use the chef generate command, and sorry, we say chef generate policy file. Now, this itself is going to generate the policy file for us. But if you are very specific and want your policy file to be named accordingly, you can also mention the name of the policy file here. Let me first execute this one. And if you notice here, the policy file has been created. Now, let me also show you how it would look like if I had to give it a specific name. Web.rb. And there you go. We have two policy files here. Just one thing that you need to keep note. By default, we use policyfile.rb in all the code bases. If you want to change the name to something like a web.rb, you will have to make this, you'll have to specify this early on. So now that we have our policy files ready, let's open it up and look what it looks like. All right, so I know I have had a huge build up to this and you probably are disappointed to see just 3 lines of code here, but that's the beauty of policy files. It's really that simple and it has just 3 lines that really matter. So the first one would obviously be the name, the default source, and lastly, the run list. These are the three components that really make up your entire policy files that I have been talking about for so long. So we are going to look at each of them one by one, but before we get started, right here, there is more information if you need to know more about the attributes or you get stuck anywhere. Always go to the docs page, and we have plenty of information about policy file, and you will be definitely sorted there. So let's start with the name. Let's give it some name. This is a simple one, so I don't need to really go crazy here. So let me just say test server, and that's good. All right. The next thing that we need to mention for our policy file is where do they find the cookbooks. So for example, you have your own cookbook, or you want to get a cookbook which is in the supermarket, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So for those of you who haven't seen or do not know what cookbooks or what the supermarket is, it's a marketplace which has all the cookbooks, over 3,000 cookbooks, both created by Chef as well as the community, available for you to easily use, so that you do not have to create all the recipes and cookbooks from scratch. So you can just mention your default source as supermarket here. Also, Chef policy files take community as the same as supermarket. So even if you replace this with community, it's still going to point to supermarket. If you are using a private supermarket, then you can also mention that. So let's say default source. And yes, you can mention multiple sources. So you can also give the public supermarket as well as your private supermarket at the same time. Supermarket, and you need to provide the URL of your private supermarket. In this case, let me just give an example. It would be something like mysupermarket.progress.com. Additionally, you can also fetch your cookbooks from a Chef server, from the Chef repo, if wherein it will pull cookbooks from a monolithic cookbook repo. And also you can fetch your cookbooks from the Artifactory, which pulls from the Artifactory server. But remember that this requires an API key to be mentioned in the config.rb file. All right, so now that we have our source mentioned, let's go to run list. So run list is basically mentioning which cookbooks that specifically that we want to use, or even specifically which recipes that we want to use. So let's search for some cookbooks in the supermarket, and let's see how we can use it. So I want to probably do an audit. So I'm just going to search for audit in Chef Supermarket. And all right, so we have 9 cookbooks which help us do audit, most of which are from Chef itself. I'm going to pick the one which is right at the top. And yeah, so what I need to do right now is just mention the name of the cookbook. Now in this case, it's audit. So I'm going to put run list as audit. And that's it. You have your policy file ready and good to test. So let's take this for a spin. I'm going to remove the private supermarket because it's not a valid one. And I'm going to save this. So how do you so now that you have made all of these changes to your policy file, you have mentioned, specified what exactly you want, how do we communicate to Chef to get it live? So for that, what you need to do is run the Chef install command, and you need to say Chef install policy file .rb. So there you can see it's building the policy named test server, and it's using the cookbook audit 9.5.0, which is, I'm guessing, the latest one in the Chef Supermarket. So yes, we already have our cookbook ready, policy file ready, and we also have the revision ID here that, and if you have noticed, it said that the log file is also created now. Even though I was talking about, oops. So here you would notice that now there is a policy file .log.json which is generated. Now, even though for so long I was talking about policy file being immutable, in reality, it is the log.json, which is the real policy file. The policy file.rb is just a front facing thing that you as a practitioner can interact with, mention your requirements, and Chef would then create this policy file.log.json, which is going to be immutable, and it's what Chef really uses during the run. So also let us look at what it has inside. So I'm going to open it, and if you see, it says revision ID. This is going to be the same as what was mentioned. It mentions the name as test server. It has the run list. So we are going to use the audit. And it also mentions about the cookbook logs. For example, we are using version 9.5.0. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Chef policy files also have a unique identifier, which is right here in this case. Now, this is, think of it kind of like a checksum. Every time this policy file is every time there's a run happening and the policy file is used, Chef is going to verify that this identifier matches with the cookbook. So in this case, with the audit cookbook. If at any given time this identifier doesn't match, it's just not going to execute, which means this is an added layer of protection, security, if you will. And this really makes make sure that there is no unwanted elements or unwanted cookbooks or unwanted recipes coming in your production server unknowingly. So this really is a very useful feature and something that is highly underrated, but I feel has a lot of importance. You will also see the rest as attributes being empty. We are going to come to that shortly. And you have solution dependencies, again, the cookbook that we're using. So that was how we got our first policy file up and running. Now, in this case, what we did was we took the default cookbook, which was in the Chef Supermarket. We took the default version, the latest in this case, and created the policy file. But what if we want a specific version within our policy file? And for all the files that I've been talking, one thing that I've been mentioning is we can specify exactly which version we want. And so let's see how we can do that using this. So let's say I want to audit using an older version. I don't know why I would do that, but just for the sake of this example, let's go with 9.2.1. So what I need to do is I need, so when I click this, all right. So when I click this, it's going to show me the snippet that I can use for my policy file. And right here, I just need to copy this and paste it in my run list. So right now, all my run list said was use the audit cookbook. But now we are going to say use cookbook audit, but version 9.2.1 from the supermarket. Now, if for those of you who have missed this, and if you're like me and you hate to constantly keep writing cookbook, and all of that, in our most recent release of Chef Infra Client, we also added the metadata feature for policy files. So that's something which will come really handy when you don't want to keep mentioning the parts of the cookbooks over and over again. So pro tip right there. All right, coming back to this, I'm going to save this and let's do a chef install again and see what happens. Install policy files file.rb. So Chef did put in the new cookbook. Did create a new policy file, but if you notice, it's still using the same audit 9.5.0. And I can confirm by going back to the log.json that it hasn't changed. Let me reopen this for you. See, it's still 9.5.0. This is because by default, Chef, this is the whole point of immutability that I was talking about at the beginning. By default, Chef doesn't let anything change your policy files, irrespective of the updates or any kind of external interference that is coming. But if you really need to update your policy files, or you need to make some changes, like in this case, then what you need to first do is do a Chef update and policy file.rb. And now if you notice, it's building the policy file, and now it's using audit 9.2.1, which is the version that we specified. And if I open this again, there you go, version 9.2.1. So the log.json file is also updated accordingly. All right, so now we saw how you can create your policy file, how you can specify the exact version. One other thing that I really want to talk about is using policy file across different stages. So initially we were talking about how you can have your policy files for, be it in your QA environment or in your staging environment or in the production environment. So let's see how we can do that. And to do that, what we do is we use policy groups, which you would have to first create in client.rb by specifying which your policy groups are. So in this case, I'm assuming there is a policy group for QA and one for prod. So in policy files, what I'm going to do is mention the specific requirements for each of these groups. So let's go back to my policy file. All right, so I'm going to say default for policy group QA for the cookbook audit, use the database. Let's say QADB. Similarly, for default for the policy group prod, use the same cookbook audit, but for prod, instead of using the QADB database, let's use ProdDB. And now let's save this. And I'm going to do a Chef update again. All right, and let's open the log.json file to see what changed. All right, so the revision ID, run list, cookbook logs, everything remains the same. But what has changed is the attributes. So now you have a QA attribute which mentions that for the cookbook audit specific to the QA policy group, you need to use the database QADB. And for even though the exact same cookbook would also be used in prod, the database to be used is proddb. It also gives you the option to override attributes. You can just mention if there is any specific thing that you would like it to be overridden, and you can mention that here. And that's it. So that's basically how policy files are. Even I know we started with 3 lines and we went to a couple more, but it's simplistic yet very effective. And that's what makes it really that great. One last thing that I would love to cover is in terms of, we talked about the air-gapped environments wherein it's not possible to directly do a chef push. And how do you get your policy files over to that? So Chef policy files lets you export them, and that's exactly what we are going to be doing now. So let's do. Oops, I think sorry, my system seems to be frozen. Just give me a moment. Let me get it back up. Hang on. Let me see. Okay, I think we're back. Yep. So let's export this policy files so that we can use it in the air-gapped environment. So let's just say chef export and policy file.rb. But now you also need to mention where you would want this to be saved. So you need to mention the directory path. So I'm going to say, just say test1, and there you go. So you probably noticed a new folder has appeared here called test1. And if you open it, you would see everything that your policy file requires, not just the policy file itself, but also the dependencies, the cookbooks, everything being downloaded right here. Now, this can be a little difficult to transfer. So you also have an option to create an archived file, which you can directly push. And all you need to do is give the attribute A, and that would be within test1. And now you have a file here which has all of these things right here. So all in all, Chef policy files makes it really simple for you to achieve a lot of consistency while maintaining both the efficiency and maintaining control over all your systems. And as always, if you want to get this onto a live system, all you need to do is do a chef push. This would work equally well for both your on-prem as well as cloud services. You can also do a knife bootstrap to bootstrap it, and you should be fine. So, all right, let's go back. So just to summarize what we discussed today, I know we are running out of time, but using Chef policy files, you can make sure that your cookbooks are running the same version in production that you tested while it was in development, which means you have created immutable policy files or immutable artifacts. It also streamlines the roles and environment patterns by placing dependency management into a single workflow. And finally, and most importantly, it solves the entire problems around roles and environment versioning. So if you want to know more about policy files, you can head over to Learn Chef. We have a course, Chef Infra 101, which has an entire module on policy files. Also, head over to Docs if you want to know more about the attributes or any other options that you can, the way you can customize policy files for as per your needs. Couple of announcements. So you probably already know, but I really want to reiterate, Chef Infra Client 17 is now available. You really must try it out. And if you want to know what's new, go watch the launch event. You will, along with all the amazing announcements and new features, you will get to watch Tim release colorful balloons and pop a champagne on screen. Also, if you want to stay updated with the latest releases or any updates from the chef team, or if you just have questions for the chef team or questions related to any of the products that you're using, do head over to the discourse channel, and you will definitely get it resolved as soon as possible. And finally, my favorite announcement, unless you have been living under a rock all this while, you probably have already heard that ChefConf 2021 is happening online from September 7th to 9th. So if you haven't registered yet, go now and register right away. And on a very related note, the call for speakers also is open till tonight. So if you have something cool that you have been wanting to talk about Chef, or if you just want to showcase what you have been using Chef for, or how you have been using Chef for, or anything in DevOps that you really want the community to hear about, then you should definitely use ChefConf as a platform to voice out your opinions. But you have until tonight to register for the session. Submit your papers right away. And also the awesome Chef Awards nominations are open. So if you want to nominate anyone who has been doing amazing stuff, or even yourself within the chef community, go ahead and fill out the nomination. So that's about it from me. Let's take a couple of questions that we have. Okay, so the first question that we have is,